Trump is going to invade Venezuela, and Maduro has given him every justification he needs. You may not want to hear this analysis, but the military planning is already underway, the legal framework is being prepared, and the timeline is set for 2025. What we're witnessing isn't random escalation or diplomatic posturing. It's the systematic preparation for the first major American military intervention in Latin America since Panama in 1989. The intelligence reaching my sources in Washington is unambiguous. Pentagon planning for Venezuelan operations has moved from contingency scenarios to operational timelines. Special Operations Command has conducted training exercises specifically designed for Venezuelan terrain. This isn't preparation for diplomacy. This is preparation for war. Maduro's recent actions have provided Trump with everything necessary to justify invasion under both international and domestic law. The constitutional crisis following disputed elections gives America legal cover to support democratic restoration. The humanitarian disaster provides moral justification. The security threat posed by criminal organizations creates national defense imperatives that override sovereignty concerns. But the real triggers involve great power competition, energy security, and hemisphere control. Venezuela has become the focal point for Russian and Chinese influence in America's traditional sphere of influence. That influence represents an existential challenge to American hemispheric dominance. The Monroe Doctrine, proclaimed in 1823, established the Western Hemisphere as America's exclusive sphere of influence. Venezuela today represents the gravest violation of Monroe Doctrine principles since the Cuban Missile Crisis. Russian military advisors operate Venezuelan air defenses. Chinese intelligence services monitor American activities. Iranian military cooperation provides Venezuela with asymmetric capabilities designed to threaten American interests. Trump understands that tolerating this presence invites further expansion. If Russia can operate military systems in Venezuela without consequences, why not in Nicaragua or Cuba? The strategic calculations are straightforward. America cannot maintain global dominance while allowing adversaries to operate freely in its own hemisphere. Maduro's government has systematically created the conditions that make American intervention inevitable. The electoral fraud destroyed his domestic legitimacy. The economic policies created hyperinflation and social collapse. The criminal networks that control territory proved his inability to maintain order. More importantly, Maduro's dependence on Russian and Chinese support made him a proxy for hostile powers rather than an independent leader. The migration crisis provides the immediate justification that American domestic politics requires. Over 7 million Venezuelans have fled their country, creating refugee flows that destabilize neighboring states and ultimately reach the American border. Colombian cities are overwhelmed by Venezuelan migrants competing for jobs and housing. Brazilian resources are stretched beyond capacity managing Venezuelan refugee camps. American immigration systems face increasing pressure from asylum seekers traveling thousands of miles from Venezuelan chaos. Trump's political base views this migration flow as a direct threat to American security and prosperity. Venezuelan criminals embedded within refugee populations bring violence to American communities. Venezuelan drug trafficking networks exploit migration routes to transport narcotics into American markets. Venezuelan economic collapse creates instability that spreads throughout the hemisphere. The humanitarian argument reinforces political necessity with moral imperative. Venezuelan hospitals lack basic medicines and equipment. Venezuelan children suffer from malnutrition at rates comparable to war zones. Venezuelan infrastructure has collapsed to the point where electricity and water are unreliable luxuries. Venezuelan currency has become worthless paper that citizens use for crafts rather than commerce. International organizations have documented these conditions exhaustively, providing legal foundation for humanitarian intervention. The responsibility to protect doctrine establishes that sovereignty includes obligations to protect citizens from mass atrocities. Venezuelan opposition leaders have already requested international assistance, providing political cover that distinguishes intervention from conquest. The energy dimension adds strategic urgency to political and humanitarian concerns. Venezuela possesses the world's largest proven oil reserves, larger than Saudi Arabia or Russia. Under competent management, Venezuelan oil production could supply global markets while reducing dependence on hostile producers. Under Maduro's mismanagement, Venezuelan production has collapsed, while strategic infrastructure falls under foreign control. Russian oil companies now control significant portions of Venezuelan production capacity. Chinese loans have secured Chinese control over Venezuelan refineries and export facilities. This means that Venezuelan energy resources, which should contribute to Western energy security, instead serve the interests of America's primary strategic competitors. Every barrel of Venezuelan oil that strengthens Russian or Chinese energy companies is a barrel that doesn't strengthen American allies. Trump's energy strategy requires securing reliable supplies for American allies while denying resources to American adversaries. Venezuelan regime change serves both objectives simultaneously. Replacing Maduro with a competent pro-Western government would restore Venezuelan production to full capacity while redirecting exports toward American and allied markets. The military planning reflects lessons learned from previous American interventions in complex environments. Unlike Iraq or Afghanistan, Venezuela operations would have clear objectives, overwhelming local support, and regional legitimacy. Venezuelan opposition groups provide intelligence, logistics support, and post-conflict governance capacity. Colombian and Brazilian governments offer staging areas, supply lines, and peacekeeping assistance. Venezuelan military capabilities pose minimal threat to American forces equipped with precision weapons and advanced technology. Venezuelan air defenses are aging Soviet systems that American electronic warfare can neutralize easily. Venezuelan naval forces consist of patrol boats and submarines that American sea power would eliminate quickly. Venezuelan ground forces are poorly equipped conscripts with limited training and questionable loyalty to an unpopular regime. More importantly, Venezuelan forces would face popular insurrection rather than foreign invasion, as Venezuelan civilians in most regions would welcome American intervention as liberation rather than resist it as occupation. Venezuelan military officers understand that their future depends on cooperation with inevitable American victory rather than futile resistance to overwhelming American power. The timeline reflects both political necessity and military opportunity. Trump's inauguration provides political mandate while Venezuelan economic collapse accelerates social breakdown. Military operations would begin with airstrikes against Venezuelan command centers and heavy weapons. This would be followed by special forces insertion and regular army occupation of major cities. The political phase would establish transitional government under Venezuelan opposition leadership with American military support. This government would immediately restore democratic elections, privatize state enterprises, and reorient foreign policy toward cooperation with regional democracies. International responses would follow predictable patterns. European governments would express concern while privately supporting democratic restoration. Latin American democracies would provide formal support. Russian and Chinese opposition would be limited to diplomatic protests, as neither power has capability to defend Venezuela against American intervention. Brazilian reaction presents the most significant regional complication for American planning. Brazil views Venezuela as falling within its sphere of influence and has historically opposed American military intervention in South America. However, Brazilian resources are already overwhelmed by Venezuelan refugees, and Brazilian security is threatened by Venezuelan criminal networks. Brazilian government calculations may conclude that American intervention serves Brazilian interests, despite concerns about American dominance. Colombian cooperation is essentially guaranteed, given Colombian security threats from Venezuelan territory and Colombian economic costs from Venezuelan migration. Colombian military forces have been conducting cross-border operations against Venezuelan-based criminal groups for years. Colombian participation in American intervention would be framed as extending existing counter-narcotics and counter-terrorism cooperation rather than supporting foreign invasion. The economic reconstruction phase would be managed through American-led coalition rather than unilateral American administration. Venezuelan oil resources would be developed through partnerships between American companies and legitimate Venezuelan government, ensuring both Venezuelan prosperity and American energy security. Venezuelan infrastructure would be rebuilt using American technology and financing, creating long-term economic relationships that serve mutual interests. Venezuelan refugee populations would be repatriated under international supervision, with reconstruction assistance to rebuild devastated communities. The precedent established would demonstrate American willingness to enforce hemispheric security. Other Latin American governments would receive clear messages about consequences of hosting hostile foreign powers. Chinese investments in Latin American infrastructure would face American scrutiny. Russian energy partnerships would face economic pressure. The domestic American political benefits would strengthen Trump's position. Successful Venezuelan intervention would demonstrate military superiority and presidential leadership while eliminating humanitarian crisis that generates unwanted immigration. Opposition criticism would be undermined by humanitarian improvements and democratic restoration. The long-term strategic consequences would extend beyond Venezuela to reshape American position globally. Successful regime change would demonstrate that American power remains effective despite recent setbacks. Energy markets would shift in favor of American allies. Global perceptions of American credibility would improve based on successful defense of stated interests. The risks of intervention are significant but manageable compared to risks of continued inaction. Prolonged Venezuelan chaos threatens regional stability through refugee flows and criminal violence. Venezuelan humanitarian disaster will continue regardless of American action, but intervention offers possibility of rapid improvement. Military success is virtually guaranteed given overwhelming American advantages. The window for intervention is closing as Venezuelan collapse accelerates and regional destabilization spreads. Chinese and Russian investments create facts on the ground that become more difficult to reverse over time. Venezuelan refugee flows are overwhelming regional capacity. Trump's decision to proceed reflects realist calculation that American hemispheric dominance requires decisive action against Monroe Doctrine violations. The humanitarian crisis provides moral justification, the migration flows provide political necessity, and the foreign occupation provides strategic imperative. Maduro's dependence on hostile powers made this confrontation inevitable. The only remaining question is timing. Military considerations favor rapid action before Venezuelan defenses can be reinforced. Political considerations support early action, while American attention remains focused domestically, and international competitors remain distracted. Venezuela's fate was sealed when Maduro chose foreign patrons over domestic legitimacy. Small nations cannot survive when they become battlegrounds for great power competition. The strategic necessity is that American hemispheric dominance cannot survive Venezuelan submission to hostile powers. Trump understands this calculation. Maduro has made his choice. The consequences are now inevitable.